Alright, welcome back. So glad you're here. This video is going to continue a series on natural law in the Chronicles of Narnia. I wrote a paper that appeared in a book called Philosophy in the Chronicles of Narnia a few years ago, a couple decades ago. The book was edited by Jerry Walls and Gregory Bossum. And really nice volume on Philosophy in Narnia. I'm not an expert on Lewis or Narnia. I'm just a fan and a philosopher of general philosopher and a fairly devoted fan, I guess, of the Chronicles and of Lewis. But I'd been teaching the Abolition of Man in my undergraduate courses for a number of years, and then this call for papers came out for philosophy in Narnia. I thought, it'd be really good is to have something on the Abolition of Man and how it connects to Narnia. So I wrote this paper on natural law in Narnia called the Tao of Narnia. The term Tao is a term that Lewis uses in the Abolition of Man, his great work on the defense of natural law. He refers to it for shorthand to the doctrine of objective value, which is the idea that certain attitudes are really true and others really false to the kinds of things we are and the kind of thing the universe is. It's my rough quotation of the doctrine of objective value. He calls it the Tao. He uses the term Tao for shorthand to refer to the doctrine of objective value. It's just easier to say that way. But he also uses it to show that natural law is not an English thing, or a British thing, or a European thing, or a Western thing. It's a universal thing that applies to everyone, everywhere, at all times. It's a part of the fabric of reality. And this is an entirely Christian view and consistent, in my opinion, with Aquinas' view of natural law. In a couple of the other videos in the series, I talk more about that. But in this video, I want to consider two possible responses to natural law, or the doctrine of objective value, which Lewis considers in the Abolition of Man. In the previous video, I gave an illustration of the first of the three possible responses to the doctrine of objective value, and in this video I want to look at the other two. So the first response, so once you have the doctrine laid out, again, the doctrine of objective value is that there are moral realities which we need to conform to if we want to be good. That's a rough way to put it. But there's three ways to respond to the doctrine of objective value. One, you can accept it as a whole. Just accept it and live by it. Number two, you can accept it in part. You can reject it in part. You can pick and choose and try and live that way. Another option is to reject it entirely. So in the first illustration in the Narnia context, the Narniverse, I guess, Narniverse, I'm not sure what to call it. The illustration I gave was Peter, hiking Peter, who accepted the doctrine of objective value and lived it out throughout the way he appears in the series. And he's one character among others. But there are two other options, and those two I want to look at in this video. Instead of following the Tao completely, one could accept parts of it and reject others. In other words, I may say, yeah, there's right and wrong, but I get to determine which parts of right and wrong I think are right and which parts I think are wrong. So I kind of accept the objectivity value, but I don't accept it for everything in life. In other words, I'm an objectivist in part and a subjectivist or a relativist in part. This is maybe a partial objectivist or a partial relativist or something like that. So let me give you an illustration of that response. Now, in the Abolition of Man, this is chapter 2 of the Abolition of Man, what Lewis calls the innovators. Okay, this is the innovators. Pickers and choosers. Okay. Smorgasbord, natural law. Take some, leave the rest. Okay. So instead of following natural law completely, you can pick and choose which parts of natural law to accept. An example of this might be some characters from Narnia. One might be Shift the Ape or Miraz as examples. So in the Abolition of Man, Lewis calls these types of people innovators. They tried to live as if there were objective values in some areas of life, but not in others. Consequences of trying to do this are usually disastrous. Things end very well. Shift, for example, was eaten by the false god Tash. Miraz was knifed by his own man. Shift, the ugly ape, knew that it was a good thing to have a ruler, especially if the ruler were him. Right, so having someone in charge of things. But he rejected the basic principle of natural law, that a ruler should have the interest of the people in mind when he or she rules. For example, you want a philosophical example of this from the history of philosophy. Look at Plato's Republic in Book 1 for a nice argument to this effect, that might doesn't make right. Schiff demanded that those people respect those in authority, and this seems to be a valid principle of traditional morality. Right? In other words, if someone's in authority, give honor where honor is due, custom. Right? This is a New Testament principle, and I'm sure you can find examples of that outside the New Testament. It's a valid principle of traditional morality. But another concept that is present in natural law is the concept of ruling fairly and justly. Schiff, for example, thought that he could pick up the former principle as something true and valuable, but at the same time deny the latter. So the problem here is the selectivity of moral values. That leads to a kind of arbitrariness. I've got some bugs out here today. That's always exciting. So the problem with this is the arbitrariness that undermines the very possibility of there being any real objective value for any ethical judgments. So I can't consistently claim that honoring authority is a real value without at the same time maintaining that caring for one's people is a real value. Schiff had to learn this the hard way with his rather objective encounter with Tash. We can't pick and choose our own morality. Okay, now here's another example. Mirage. This was someone in Caspian world. Mirage denied that loyalty to Caspian, the rightful king, was a legitimate moral demand, yet insisted that his own men be loyal to him, which, as he painfully discovered, they declined to do. In both cases, these characters denied the validity of a particular part of the Tao while attempting to retain others. This couldn't be held consistently, as each of them learned. In other words, I can't pick and choose which part of natural law I want to accept and which I want to reject, because all parts of natural law rest on the self-same, self-evident moral axioms or moral reality, right? Okay, so this, again, Lewis deals with this in the Abolition of Man in the second chapter, The Innovators, and he clearly shows in that work that I can't pick and choose morality. And he shows that any attempt to do so leads to an incoherent and contradictory state of affairs and self-undermining. It's a total disaster. And I love the way that he illustrates this in the Chronicles, because he shows you what happens if I pick and choose morality. If I'm subjectivist here, objectivist here, I end up usually ending disastrous in my life. And Mirage and Schiff, well, you know the endings for those if you're a fan of the Narnia series. Okay, so that's the second option. The third option, so again, let me review. The doctrine of objective value, that there are real objective moral realities that impinge upon us, that we ought to conform ourselves to. That's roughly the doctrine of objective value. And there's three possible responses that Lewis lays out in the Abolition of Man. One, accept it. Two, accept it in part, reject it in part, and that's the view we just looked at. Now here's the third option. This is to reject it entirely. Okay. So now this third option in the Abolition of Man, Lewis calls these people the conditioners. But he illustrates the conditioners, the situation of the conditioners, really nicely in the Chronicles of Narnia. So this is to reject, again, this position is to reject natural law entirely, and then create your own moral reality, whole cloth. Sometimes people call this, I'm going to manifest my own morality. I love that term manifest. It's so goofy. Just enjoy it. So a couple characters from the Chronicles that I take to be illustrations of this position are Uncle Andrew and Ginger the cat. They illustrate this type of response to the doctrine of objective value. Again, Lewis calls these people conditioners in the Abolition. They want to get rid of natural law entirely, create an artificial one based on their own subjective values. But since on this view there are no real values, the values which their artificial natural law are based can be nothing but what these people prefer. Right? In other words, it's reduced to personal preference. It's their own whim that drives them, and when their whim means nothing other than their bodily desires. Right? In other words, so my body ends up ruling me. In other words, natural law doesn't rule me, and then my physical body, nature rules me. Thus, when one denies the objectivity of natural law, one has reduced morality to nothing more than bodily desires. In other words, being a person, a rational, intelligent agent, has been entirely abolished. Right? In other words, my intellect is now ruling my heart over my bodily desires. Now my bodily desires are ruling over me. And for those of you listening to this who are Platonists or familiar with Plato's tripart division of the human person and the Republic especially, you'll see that this is the entire usurpation of yourself, your soul, as a little city-state, a little republic, with your body ruling over you. It's the tyranny of the body. And Lewis gives some really nice illustrations of this in the Chronicles. Consider Ginger the cat. This is from the last battle. Ginger denies all of the truth or reality behind Aslan and what he stands for. Ginger wants nothing to do, wants nothing but his own power and seeks it in league with Shift and the Calormene invaders. But notice what happens when Ginger takes seriously the denial of all natural laws. He was face to face with his own abolition. The abolition of cat. Maybe some of you think that's a good thing, just in general. Look, I don't think cats are a result of the fall. Some Christians argue that, but I'm not willing to go that far. But when Ginger, the cat, totally rejects natural law, Ginger, as a talking animal, is undone. He's undone as a talking beast. He's changed back into a dumb, irrational animal. And I remember just reading this as a kid. He screams. He's talking along, and he's like, ah, wow, wow, right? That screams he got. And Tyrion is quoting from the last battle. Tyrion felt quite certain, and so did others, that the cat, capital C, was trying to say something, but nothing came out of its mouth except ordinary ugly cat noises you might hear from an angry or frightened old tomcat in a backyard in England. And the longer he caterwauled, the less like a talking beast he looked. The abolition of cat. Right? You reject the natural law entirely, you return to your animalistic state. And depends on how pessimistic you are in any given day, and wondering whether or not we here in the West, the Christian West, are reverting. We're all gingers now. I don't mean redheads. Ginger the cat. Is Ginger a red cat? Maybe, I don't know. Well, Uncle Andrew, I think, had the same problem. He wanted to make up his own natural law, and he was willing to get it no matter what he had to do. Guinea pigs or innocent children. Little guinea pigs. One that got stuck in the world between the worlds. After his failed attempt to invade and exploit Narnia, Uncle Andrew tries to talk to the Narnian talking animals, but, quote, the beasts couldn't understand him any more than he could understand them. They didn't hear any words, only a vague sizzling noise. This is in the creation account of Narnia, where Uncle Andrew's trying to talk and reason with these animals who've been given voices by Aslan, and the animals can't understand him. Even the rational power of communication was lost to this old magician. Might have been lost for good if he could have been persuaded or could have pursued his schemes indefinitely. I think an interesting overlap would be between Uncle Andrew and the scientists that Lewis uses in his space trilogy. I think the same motivation is there to conquer new worlds. For rationality itself, a part of which speed is a part of, isn't the kind of thing that can be whatever we want it to be. To make reason into a tool of power to be used however we wish, that's to abandon the very essence of reason in us and to surrender it to irrational in us. It's usurpation of reason by our bodily desires. Just like Ginger, Uncle Andrew was ultimately undone and functionally reduced to a non-talking animal. Fortunately, his end wasn't as bad as Ginger's. At least he had, quote, learned his lesson, and in old age he became a nicer and less selfish man than he was ever been before. It's from the Chronicles there. So, this is an inescapable logic of the Tao of Narnia, or the natural law of Narnia. You can live within it. That's one option, and enjoy the good life and possibility of eternal life, ever to move further up and further into God's eternal kingdom. You can be a picker and chooser and end up in a deadly self-destructive contradiction. Or you can abolish man and beast and every other talking person by replacing objective values with personal preferences grounded in bodily desires. The Chronicles is what we would emulate. Hopefully, Lewis, I think, his purpose, the point of the Chronicles, is that we would imitate those people who followed natural law, like Lucy, Peter, Tyrion, and the other Narnian heroes, and to choose to embrace natural law in its entirety. All right, thanks for watching. I think I'll do one more video on this, but I appreciate your time.
Stay psyched, Grom. You!